The shrill blare of my phone tore me out of a restless sleep, the kind where dreams twist into knots, leaving you more exhausted than when you started. My head throbbed from yesterday's marathon shift at the garage, and I groaned as I fumbled for the phone on my nightstand. The screen's glow felt like a knife to my tired eyes. At first, I barely registered the words blinking at me, but then the cold knot in my stomach tightened. Emergency alert. Zombies detected. Avoid all contact. Remain indoors and await further instructions. This is not a drill. I stared at the alert, my brain struggling to connect the words into something sensible. Zombies. It had to be a prank. A hacker with a sick sense of humor, maybe. Or some test message that accidentally got sent out. But as I sat there, staring at the blinking red text, I noticed my heart pounding in a way I couldn't quite explain. The air in the room felt heavier, like I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was. My house wasn't much, a one-story fixer-upper in the middle of a suburban neighborhood. I'd gotten it cheap, the kind of cheap that came with a leaky roof and an air conditioner that coughed more than it cooled. But it was home. At least it had been. Now, sitting there in my rumpled bed, the walls seemed thinner, the windows fragile. The faint sound of distant sirens tugged at the edge of my hearing, growing louder, then cutting off abruptly. That was strange. Sirens didn't just stop. They faded out, stretched thin by distance. My fingers hovered over the screen, debating whether to dismiss the alert or keep staring at it like it held some kind of answer. Then I heard it, a muffled thud from outside. I froze, breath caught in my throat, straining to hear past the ringing silence of my house. It came again, a dull, hollow bang, like something heavy hitting metal. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my boots scraping against the wood floor as I stood. The house creaked in protest with each step I took toward the window. I reached for the curtain and hesitated. The sirens had been replaced by something else, a low, dissonant hum, punctuated by the occasional scream. Not the kind of scream you'd hear during a block party or a barbecue gone wrong. No, this was primal, desperate, human, but barely. I parted the curtain just enough to peer out. My street, normally the epitome of suburban monotony, was alive with motion. A car skidded down the road, its tires screeching before it plowed into a mailbox. The driver flung the door open and scrambled out, but they didn't get far. Someone rushed at them from the shadows between two houses. At first glance, it looked like a person, tall, thin, and moving faster than I'd thought possible. But there was something wrong with the way it moved, like its body was strung up on invisible wires and a puppeteer was yanking it around. The driver screamed, a wet, choking sound, as the figure tackled them to the ground. My brain tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was some kind of freak accident, a desperate mugging. But when the figure sank its teeth into the driver's neck, ripping and tearing with savage ferocity, my stomach lurched. Blood sprayed in a crimson arc, painting the car's windshield and the pavement beneath them. The driver twitched once, twice, then went still. I stumbled back from the window, heart hammering like it was trying to break out of my chest. My phone buzzed in my hand, another alert lighting up the screen. Stay indoors. Avoid contact. The outbreak is spreading. Outbreak. That word hit me like a gut punch. I wasn't a scientist, but I knew enough to understand what it implied. Whatever was happening out there wasn't isolated. It wasn't contained. The garage door 2 houses down creaked open, and a man I recognized as Mr. Bowers stepped out, clutching a shotgun in one hand. His face was pale, his eyes wide with panic. "Get back inside," I whispered, my voice too quiet to carry. He didn't hear me, or if he did, he ignored it. He took a few steps toward the street, his shotgun raised. The thing that had been attacking the driver whipped its head up as if it had heard the tiniest noise. It stood slowly, unnervingly, and fixed its eyes on Bowers. Even from my window, I could see the jagged gash in its cheek, the exposed teeth beneath. It smiled, a horrifying parody of a human expression, before rushing toward him. Bowers fired once, the shotgun blast echoing through the street. The creature stumbled, but it didn't stop. It slammed into him, and they both disappeared behind the edge of the garage door. His screams followed, cutting off suddenly. My legs felt like jelly, and I realized I was gripping the windowsill so hard my knuckles had gone white. The air in the room was thick, choking, as if the chaos outside had somehow seeped in. I looked around my house, at the thin wooden doors, the flimsy locks. None of it seemed sturdy enough anymore. The alert wasn't a joke. The chaos wasn't a fluke. My quiet little street had turned into a war zone, and I was standing on the front lines with nothing but the clothes on my back and a phone that wouldn't stop buzzing. My mind raced. I needed a plan, but all I could think about was how thin my walls were and how loud my breathing sounded in the silence of the house. The sound of hammering echoed through the hollow silence of my house, each strike driving nails into the wooden planks I'd dragged in from the shed. My breath was ragged, my shirt soaked through with sweat despite the morning chill. The boards weren't much, scrap from an unfinished project I'd meant to get around to someday, but they were all I had to keep the chaos outside from pouring in. The adrenaline that had carried me through the initial shock of the outbreak was wearing thin. My hands trembled as I drove the last nail into the frame of the front window. For a moment, I stood there, staring at the crude barricade. It felt flimsy, like a paper shield against a raging inferno. I stepped back, listening to the distant sounds outside. Screams, the crackling of fire, and that haunting, guttural moan that seemed to crawl under my skin. My phone vibrated again, the emergency alert flashing its unchanging message. "Zombies detected. Remain indoors. Await instructions." Instructions weren't coming, that much was clear. I glanced around the room, the realization settling in like a weight on my chest. This house, as familiar as it was a coffin waiting to close. If the infected broke through, I'd have nowhere to run. I grabbed my backpack from the corner, the same one I used to lug tools back and forth to the shop. It wasn't much, but it had enough space for essentials: water bottles, a first aid kit, and a few granola bars I'd scavenged from the kitchen. My crowbar, heavy and cold in my hand, would have to do for protection. The streets outside were another world entirely. As I stepped through the back door, leaving my barricaded front behind, the stench of smoke and decay hit me like a physical force. The once quiet suburb was unrecognizable. Cars were abandoned in the middle of the road, their doors flung open as if their drivers had vanished mid-panic. Flames licked at the remnants of a mailbox, casting flickering shadows across the asphalt. I stuck to the edges, keeping low, my heart pounding with every step. The eerie moans of the infected drifted through the air, each one a cruel reminder that I wasn't alone. I rounded a corner cautiously, my eyes scanning every shadow. My breath caught when I spotted movement ahead. A figure slumped over a car's hood. It wasn't human, not anymore. Its head jerked unnaturally, like it was sniffing the air. Blood dripped from its chin, staining its torn clothes. It looked up, its clouded eyes meeting mine. For a split second, we were both still. Then it let out a guttural snarl and lunged. Instinct kicked in. I swung the crowbar, the impact reverberating up my arms as it connected with the thing's skull. The sound was sickening, a wet crack that made my stomach churn. The creature crumpled to the ground, twitching once before going still. I staggered back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I barely had time to recover when more moans sounded behind me. I turned, spotting a group of them shuffling out of an alley. Their movements were slow but purposeful, their faces twisted in grotesque hunger. "Shit," I muttered, gripping the crowbar tighter. I backed away, my eyes darting for an escape route. The alley ahead was narrow, littered with trash and debris, but it was my only option. I sprinted, my boots slamming against the pavement. The sound of the infected chasing me was a nightmare come to life. The scrape of feet, the guttural growls, and the sickening sound of their bodies brushing against walls as they moved. I rounded a corner too fast, tripping over a fallen trash can and sprawling onto the ground. My palms scraped against the rough asphalt as I scrambled to get up. Before I could, a hand shot out and yanked me to my feet. I spun around, ready to swing, but stopped short when I saw a man standing there, holding a baseball bat. His face was grim, smeared with dirt and sweat. "Move," he barked, shoving me forward. Behind him, a teenage girl in a hoodie and jeans followed, gripping a kitchen knife. Together, we darted into an old gas station, slamming the door behind us. "Help me block this," the man shouted. I jumped into action, pushing a metal shelf against the door. The infected outside clawed at the glass, their distorted faces pressing against it. For a moment, none of us spoke, our breathing loud and ragged in the confined space. The man turned to me, his eyes sharp. "Name's Harris," he said, nodding toward the girl. "That's Tessa. We saw you out there. Figured you could use some help." I nodded, still catching my breath. "Thanks," I managed to say. Harris looked me over, his gaze lingering on the blood spattered on my shirt. "You're lucky," he said. "Those things don't give second chances." I glanced at the door, where the infected were still clawing. "Yeah," I muttered. "Lucky." Tessa, silent until now, stepped closer. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "They'll break through eventually." She was right. The barricade wouldn't hold forever, and if I wanted to survive, I had to trust them, at least for now. The convenience store sat at the edge of town, a relic of mundane days long gone. Its faded sign creaked on rusted hinges, and the shattered front window gaped like a broken jaw. Inside, the stench of decay hit me first, an overpowering blend of rotting meat, spoiled milk, and coppery blood. I gagged, pulling my shirt over my nose as Harris ushered us in, Tessa close behind. "Block the door," Harris barked, already scanning the aisles for anything useful. I grabbed a metal rack tipped on its side and hauled it in front of the entrance, wincing as it scraped across the tile floor. The noise echoed, and for a moment we all froze, listening. Outside, the moans and shuffling grew louder, but they didn't come closer. "Good enough," Harris muttered, tossing a box of cereal into his backpack. The store was a wreck. Shelves were overturned, their contents spilled in chaotic heaps. Blood smeared the walls, handprints trailing toward the back like someone had tried to claw their way out. I stepped over broken glass and a trail of dried viscera, my grip tightening on the crowbar. Tessa moved methodically, her movements sharp and purposeful as she picked through the debris. She grabbed bottled water, canned goods, and batteries, stuffing them into her own bag. I kept glancing at her, wondering how someone so young could stay so calm. "You gonna help, or just stare?" she asked, not looking up. I blinked and turned away, feeling the heat rise to my face. I searched the aisles, scooping up what I could find. A half-full pack of granola bars, a roll of duct tape, a lighter. My hands shook as I worked. Every noise felt too loud, every shadow too deep. "You think this is gonna be enough?" I asked Harris, holding up my pitiful haul. He glanced over and shrugged. "Depends. You planning to stick around here forever?" I didn't answer. The thought of staying in this place made my skin crawl, but the streets outside weren't exactly inviting either. As we worked, the tension in the air grew heavier. Harris kept barking orders, his tone sharp and impatient. Tessa barely spoke, her expression set in a scowl. And then there was the other guy, Charlie, I think he'd said his name was, hovering near the back of the store, his eyes darting nervously. "I'm telling you, we need more food," Charlie said, his voice high-pitched and jittery. "What if we're stuck here for days?" "We won't be," Harris snapped. "This is a pit stop, not a base camp. Keep your voice down." Charlie glared but didn't argue. He turned back to the shelves, muttering under his breath. The uneasy quiet didn't last. A shrill, bone-chilling wail tore through the air outside, freezing us all in place. It was unlike anything I'd heard before, a sound that hit somewhere deep in my chest, primal and terrifying. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. Harris didn't answer. He moved to the window, peeking through the cracks in the makeshift barricade. I followed, my stomach churning as I caught sight of the street. The infected weren't just shuffling anymore. Some of them moved with a terrifying speed, darting between abandoned cars and debris. Others stalked like predators, their movements calculated and silent. And then there were the ones emitting that awful sound, their mouths stretched unnaturally wide as the wails reverberated through the night. "They're evolving," Harris muttered. "Evolving?" I repeated, the word foreign and wrong in my mouth. Before he could answer, a loud crash came from the back of the store. We spun around to see Charlie, his backpack bulging, shoving canned goods into his arms. "What the hell are you doing?" Harris growled. Charlie froze, his face pale. I'm just making sure we have enough." "Enough for you, you mean?" Harris interrupted, stepping forward. "Look, man, Before Charlie could finish, he tripped over a fallen shelf, sending cans clattering to the floor. The noise was deafening, cutting through the air like a gunshot. "Damn it!" Harris snarled. The moans outside grew louder, joined by the pounding of fists against the barricade. The infected were coming. "You idiot!" Tessa hissed, grabbing her knife. Charlie scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with panic. "I didn't mean to." The glass at the front of the store shattered, and chaos erupted. The infected poured in, their grotesque forms illuminated by the flickering fluorescent lights. Harris swung his bat, the crack of impact echoing through the store. Tessa darted forward, her knife flashing as she plunged it into the neck of one of the creatures. I swung my crowbar wildly, the metal sinking into flesh with sickening resistance. Charlie screamed as one of the infected grabbed him, its teeth sinking into his shoulder. Blood sprayed as he went down, his cries turning into gurgles. "Harris, we have to go," I shouted, my voice barely audible over the carnage. He didn't argue. Grabbing Tessa, he pushed her toward the back exit. I followed, my heart pounding as the infected swarmed the store. We burst into the alley, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. Behind us, the moans and shrieks grew fainter, but they didn't stop. We didn't look back. The air was thick with the acrid stench of smoke and blood as we moved through the darkened streets, keeping low and silent. Harris took the lead, his bat slung over one shoulder, while Tessa and I trailed behind, our weapons gripped tight. Every step felt heavier than the last, the oppressive quiet punctuated only by the distant groans of the infected and the occasional gunshot that echoed through the night. The evacuation center was supposedly set up at the old high school, a sprawling complex on the edge of town. We'd heard the rumors from a crackling emergency broadcast on a radio Harris had salvaged. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot we had. "Stay close," Harris whispered, his voice low but firm. "If something moves, don't hesitate. Take it down." I nodded, my mouth dry. The streets felt like a graveyard, littered with overturned cars, scattered belongings, and bodies in various stages of decay. The silence wasn't a comfort, it was a warning. As we approached the high school, the first thing we noticed was the sound. A cacophony of screams, gunfire, and inhuman wails. Then we saw it. The evacuation zone was chaos incarnate. Floodlights illuminated the parking lot, casting long, eerie shadows over the scene. A chain-link fence surrounded the perimeter, but it was buckling under the weight of the horde pressing against it. Soldiers stood on makeshift platforms, firing into the mass of undead, their faces masks of grim determination. For every infected that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. The mob was relentless, clawing and climbing over one another, their grotesque forms writhing like a single monstrous organism. The fence gave a tortured screech, and then it collapsed, the infected pouring through like water through a broken dam. "Holy shit," I muttered, my stomach twisting. "Run," Harris barked, grabbing my arm. We sprinted toward the side of the building, skirting the edges of the carnage. The gunfire grew louder, more frantic, as the soldiers were overrun. One screamed as he was dragged down, his rifle firing wildly into the air before going silent. Tessa stumbled, and I turned just in time to catch her before she hit the ground. "I'm fine," she snapped, yanking her arm free. Her face was pale, but her eyes were hard. We ducked into an alley behind the school, the sounds of the massacre fading slightly. Harris leaned against the wall, his chest heaving. "That's not an evacuation zone," he said, his voice bitter. "It's a death trap." The sudden clang of metal made us all freeze. At first, I thought it was another part of the fence collapsing, but then I realized it was closer, too close. A shadow moved at the edge of the alley, and a low growl sent shivers down my spine. "Move!" Harris hissed, and we bolted again. The abandoned office building loomed ahead, its dark windows like empty eyes staring down at us. We crashed through the front doors, slamming them shut behind us. Harris shoved a filing cabinet in front of the doors, while Tessa and I searched for anything else to barricade with. The interior was a maze of cubicles and narrow hallways, the air stale and heavy. Papers were strewn across the floor, and the faint smell of mold clung to everything. "This won't hold for long," Harris said, stepping back from the makeshift barricade. I glanced at Tessa. She was leaning against a desk, her knife still in hand, her face drawn and pale. "We need a plan," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The plan was to get to the evacuation center," Harris snapped. "Look how that turned out." Tessa looked up sharply. "Yelling about it won't help. We're here now. What's next?" Before anyone could answer, the sound of shuffling feet echoed through the hall. My blood ran cold. They were inside. Harris motioned for us to stay quiet, his bat gripped tight. The moans grew louder, joined by the wet slap of feet on tile. "There's too many," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "We'll make it," Harris said, but there was no conviction in his tone. The first infected appeared at the end of the hallway, its grotesque form silhouetted against the dim light. Its head twitched unnaturally as it sniffed the air, and then it let out a piercing wail. "Run!" Harris shouted. We darted into the maze of cubicles, the infected pouring in behind us. I could hear their snarls, the sound of furniture being smashed as they tore through the space. "This way," Tessa yelled, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward a stairwell. We barreled up the stairs, the infected close behind. The sounds of their pursuit were deafening. Growls, moans, and the sharp crack of their bodies hitting walls as they scrambled after us. Reaching the second floor, we burst into another hallway, slamming the stairwell door shut behind us. Harris shoved a desk in front of it, his movements frantic. "We're trapped," Tessa said, her voice shaking. "No," Harris said, though his eyes betrayed him. "We just need to hold them off." The barricade rattled as the infected slammed against it, their moans rising to a fever pitch. The door wouldn't hold for long. As we stood there, catching our breath, the weight of our situation settled over us like a shroud. The sound of the horde outside was relentless, a constant reminder that there was no escape. Desperation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't let myself feel until now: hopelessness. The barricade didn't hold. It buckled under the weight of the horde, and the door splintered apart like a matchstick under a boot. They poured in, their grotesque faces and twisted bodies filling the hallway with a wave of death. Harris swung his bat with grim determination, but the sheer number of them was overwhelming. "Go!" he shouted, his voice raw and desperate. Tessa grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the far end of the corridor. We ran blindly, the sound of Harris's bat connecting with flesh and bone echoing behind us. The infected were everywhere, spilling out of every doorway, their moans blending into a symphony of chaos. A loud crash reverberated through the building as a desk overturned, and I tripped over a fallen chair. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked from my lungs. Tessa screamed, reaching for me, but an infected lunged between us, cutting her off. "Run!" I yelled, scrambling backward as the creature turned its milky, lifeless eyes on me. Tessa hesitated for a heartbeat, her face twisted with indecision. Then she disappeared around the corner, leaving me alone. The infected lunged, and I swung my crowbar instinctively, the metal colliding with its head. The impact sent shockwaves up my arms, but the creature barely staggered. It snarled, reaching for me, its rotting hands closing around the fabric of my jacket. I screamed, wrenching myself free, and ran. The streets were a nightmare. I stumbled out of the office building, the cold night air biting at my sweat-drenched skin. The town was unrecognizable, a hellscape of fire and ruin. Buildings burned unchecked, their flames licking at the night sky. Cars were piled in twisted heaps, their horns blaring endlessly. And the dead, they were everywhere. Bodies lined the streets, some motionless, others twitching with the grotesque spasms of undeath. A family huddled together near a bus stop, their faces slack with the infection as they tore into one another with feral hunger. The sound of ripping flesh and wet chewing turned my stomach, and I stumbled away, bile rising in my throat. Further down the road, a child stood alone, clutching a teddy bear. At first I thought she was alive, her small form swaying gently in the breeze. Then she turned, revealing the gaping wound in her neck and the dead, unseeing eyes. My legs buckled, and I sank to my knees, unable to tear my gaze away. This wasn't survival. This was hell. I don't know how long I wandered. Minutes, hours. The chaos blurred together, a dizzying mix of screams, growls, and the acrid stench of death. My legs carried me on autopilot, my mind barely registering where I was going. It wasn't until I turned a corner and found myself face to face with another infected that reality snapped back into focus. It was a man. Barely. His face was half gone, one eye dangling uselessly from its socket. His mouth stretched into a grotesque snarl as he lunged at me. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't listen. The infected was on me in an instant, its decaying hands closing around my arm. The smell of its breath, rotting meat and bile, made me gag. "Get off me," I screamed, swinging the crowbar wildly. The first blow glanced off its shoulder, doing little to stop it. It snarled, snapping its teeth inches from my face. I swung again, harder, and the metal connected with its skull. There was a sickening crunch, and the creature's head jerked to the side, but it didn't let go. I brought the crowbar down again and again, the blows growing more frantic as blood and bone splattered across the pavement. Finally, it collapsed, its hands loosening their grip as it crumpled to the ground. I stood there, chest heaving, staring at the mangled corpse at my feet. My hands were slick with blood, the crowbar trembling in my grip. My stomach churned, and I fell to my knees, retching violently. When the nausea subsided, I sat back on my heels, staring at my bloodied hands. This wasn't the first infected I'd seen, but it was the first I'd killed. Up close, they weren't just monsters. They had faces, clothes, remnants of the lives they'd once lived. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, my body shaking. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a hollow ache in my chest. "What's the point?" I muttered, my voice hoarse. The infected were everywhere. The town was gone. Harris and Tessa were gone. I was alone, and the world around me was crumbling. Survival felt less like a goal and more like a punishment, a cruel joke in a world that no longer made sense. I sat there in the middle of the street, the distant sounds of chaos ringing in my ears, and for the first time, I wondered if it was even worth it to keep going. The church stood at the edge of town, its towering spire silhouetted against the bruised sky. It should have been a sanctuary, a place of peace. Instead, it looked as battered and broken as everything else, its doors ajar, the once pristine white paint chipped and peeling. The stained glass windows, once beautiful depictions of saints and angels, now seemed grotesque, their colors casting eerie reflections on the blood-stained steps leading up to the entrance. I hesitated, the crowbar clutched tightly in my hand. The town had been a relentless gauntlet of horror, and every shadow seemed to hide teeth and claws, but my legs were trembling, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I needed to stop, even if only for a moment. With a cautious glance over my shoulder, I stepped inside. The air was thick and stale, carrying the faint coppery tang of blood. The pews were overturned, their polished wood scratched and broken. Belongings were scattered across the floor. Backpacks, jackets, even a child's stuffed bear with one button eye dangling by a thread. Whatever had happened here, it had been chaotic, violent, and fast. The stained glass windows cast fractured beams of light across the interior, painting the destruction in surreal reds and blues. My footsteps echoed as I moved further in, the sound unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. I found a spot near the altar, where the light from a flickering candle cast long, dancing shadows. Someone had lit it not long ago, but they were gone now, leaving behind nothing but a waxy puddle and a sense of abandonment. I sank onto a pew, my body sagging with exhaustion. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had a moment to stop, to think. My mind, though, was a minefield. Every thought was a reminder of what I'd seen. Harris swinging his bat in a futile stand, Tessa disappearing into the chaos, Charlie's screams as the infected tore him apart. I looked at my hands, still stained with dried blood. My first kill. It felt so distant, and yet so close, like the memory had burned itself into my very bones. A wave of nausea rose in my throat, and I pressed my palms to my face, trying to breathe. The scratching started faintly, like the whisper of tree branches against a window. My heart stuttered as I froze, listening. The sound grew louder, more insistent, a chorus of nails raking against the heavy wooden doors of the church. The infected had found me. I stood, every muscle in my body screaming with exhaustion, and backed away from the doors. The scratching turned to pounding, the hollow thuds reverberating through the empty space. My chest tightened as panic clawed at the edges of my mind. Then, a sharp clatter rang out, cutting through the din like a gunshot. It came from somewhere near the back of the church, a metal pan or a dropped flashlight. My heart sank. The pounding on the doors grew frenzied, the infected outside howling in response. Shadows loomed through the stained glass, distorted shapes pressing against the fragile barrier. "Shit," I muttered, spinning in place, searching for a way out. The back of the church led to a small storage room, its door hanging open. I sprinted toward it, my boots skidding on the blood-slick floor. Inside, the space was cramped and cluttered, filled with old hymnals, folding chairs, and cleaning supplies. The noise outside escalated, the sound of wood splintering filling the air. The barricade wouldn't hold. My eyes darted around the room, landing on a narrow window near the ceiling. It was high, but it was my only option. I dragged a chair over, the legs screeching against the floor, and climbed up. The window was small, barely large enough to squeeze through. I shoved it open, the rusty hinges groaning in protest, and hoisted myself up. Behind me, the sound of the barricade giving way sent a jolt of fear through my body. The infected poured in, their guttural snarls echoing through the church. I didn't look back. With a desperate push, I wriggled through the window, my shoulders scraping against the frame. I landed hard on the ground outside, the impact jarring my already battered body. The night air was cool and sharp, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the church. I scrambled to my feet, my breath hitching as I heard the infected spilling out behind me. I ran, my legs burning, the sound of their pursuit driving me forward. The world blurred around me, the shadows of the dead stretching long under the moonlight. My chest heaved, my heart pounding like a war drum. The church faded into the distance, its broken windows glowing like angry eyes. I didn't stop running until the sounds of the infected were replaced by the rhythmic thud of my heartbeat in my ears. I collapsed against a tree, my body trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My escape had been nothing short of a miracle, but the thought brought no comfort. The horde had been relentless, and I knew it wouldn't be the last time. For a moment, I closed my eyes, the image of the church's shattered sanctuary burning in my mind. Even a place of faith and hope had fallen to the chaos. What chance did the rest of us have? I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing. Stopping wasn't an option. Not yet. Not until I found something, someone, worth stopping for. The streets were a graveyard. The glow of fires illuminated the crumbling town, casting long shadows that danced across the cracked asphalt. My legs burned with every step, each breath a struggle against the cold, acrid air. The moans of the horde echoed behind me, growing louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. When I turned the corner, my heart sank. A dead-end street stretched before me, the road ending in a sheer drop where the earth had given way, exposing jagged rocks and a churning river far below. The rusted remains of a chain-link fence dangled precariously over the edge, useless against what was coming. I spun around, gripping the crowbar with shaking hands. The infected were there, shambling into view. Their grotesque faces caught the flickering light, eyes milky and lifeless, mouths twisted into grotesque snarls. There was no way out. For a moment, the weight of it all crushed me. My body sagged, and I let out a trembling breath. This was it. The end. I tightened my grip on the crowbar, the metal slick with sweat and blood. If this is how it's going to be, I muttered, then I'm taking as many of you bastards with me as I can. The first infected lunged, and I swung hard, the crowbar connecting with a sickening crunch. The creature crumpled, but the others kept coming, their moans rising in a chilling crescendo. I fought with everything I had, swinging wildly, my muscles screaming with exertion. But there were too many. For every one I struck down, two more took its place. They closed in, a wall of decay and hunger, their hands reaching, clawing. I stumbled back, my heel catching on a piece of debris. I hit the ground hard, the crowbar slipping from my grasp and clattering out of reach. The infected loomed over me, their rotting faces filling my vision. This is it, I thought, my chest tight with fear and resignation. This is how it ends. And then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that cut through the cacophony of moans. The ground beneath me vibrated as headlights pierced the gloom. A massive, fortified truck barreled down the street, its engine roaring like a beast unleashed. The vehicle plowed into the horde, sending bodies flying in every direction. Metal spikes welded to the front shredded the infected on impact, and the sound of bones crunching beneath the tires was deafening. The truck skidded to a halt, its side door swinging open. A figure leaned out, their face obscured by a gas mask. "Get in!" they shouted, their voice muffled but urgent. For a moment I couldn't move, my body frozen in shock and exhaustion. Then, the reality of the situation snapped into focus. I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the truck, the infected clawing at my heels. A hand reached out, grabbing my arm and hauling me inside. The door slammed shut just as the horde surged forward, their bodies slamming against the reinforced metal with dull thuds. The truck roared to life, lurching forward and leaving the undead in its wake. I collapsed against the wall, my chest heaving, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. The inside of the truck was a strange mix of chaos and order. Supplies were strapped to every surface, weapons lined the walls, and the faint smell of gasoline and sweat filled the air. A handful of people moved with practiced efficiency, reloading guns and checking maps. The driver glanced back, his eyes meeting mine through the visor of his helmet. "Welcome to the fight," he said, his tone grim. I nodded weakly, the weight of everything catching up to me. The relief of survival was overshadowed by the sobering realization that this wasn't over. The world I knew was gone, replaced by one where survival was the only currency, and every breath came at a cost. As the truck sped into the night, the sounds of the horde fading into the distance, I allowed myself a moment to close my eyes. For now, I was alive, but the fight had only just begun.